Waitstaff, bartenders, taxi drivers, hairstylists, casino workers, all of these professions and more derive some or most of their incomes from tips. But even though, as a tipped employee, it can be nice to have a source of daily income, that can come with potential problems when tax time rolls around. I'm the Tax Geek, and here are taxes on tips, oversimplified. First of all, let's define what actually constitutes a tip. A tip is a payment from a customer to whomever provides them services that is made freely and is not compulsory, and where the amount and recipient is determined by the customer. Tips can be in cash, charged to the customer on a debit or credit card, or it can be non-monetary items of value such as gift cards or event tickets. Service charges, such as additional charges and establishment levies for large parties, are not considered tips, and instead, the service charges are collected by the employer and distributed to the workers as part of their wages. You are responsible for taxes only on the tips you receive and keep. If your establishment pools tips, you're only taxed on what you receive from the pool. If you tip out bartenders, salon assistants, and bussers, you are not responsible for paying taxes on that money. If you're an employee, your reported tips are part of your wages and are shown in Box 1 of your W-2 and ultimately end up on Line 1A of your Form 1040. If you're self-employed or an independent contractor, your tips are part of the total income you report on Line 1 of your Schedule C. For most gig economy workers, tips are included in the amounts on your Forms 1099-K or 1099-NEC. All that said, many tipped employees run into a bit of trouble come tax time with Social Security, Medicare, or federal income taxes, but most often with state income tax. Let me try to explain why and what you might be able to do about it. Customarily, tipped employees may be paid by their employers as little as $2.13 per hour, as long as their reported tips make up the difference between that lower rate and the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. Please keep in mind different states have different minimum wages and allowable tip credit, which are usually higher than the federal requirement. Employers may also pay employees at a higher rate than the minimum wage. This video is solely concerned with an employer who pays the federal minimum wage where it is allowed. Employers may pay the minimum wage, but they must withhold taxes on both the wages and the reported tips. As restaurant prices have risen and along with it tip amounts, much of the time the wages paid are not sufficient to cover the withholding on the tips and often exceed the wages. When an employee's withholding on wages and tips exceeds the wages, withholding is done in the following order. First, Social Security, Medicare, federal and state income tax withholding on the wages. Second, Social Security and Medicare tax withholding on the tips. Next, federal income tax withholding on the tips, and finally, state income tax withholding on the tips. Let's see how this works with Wilbur, a waiter at a family restaurant in South Georgia. We're using Georgia as an example because the state's minimum wage is the same as the federal minimum wage. Wilbur just got off a week where he worked 36 hours. Wilbur's wages were $76.68, but he took home and reported $556 in tips. Let's see what happens. The Social Security and Medicare tax on Wilbur's wages is $5.86. Wilbur claims single on his federal W-4 and single with one allowance on his Georgia G-4 form. Therefore, his wages are not subject to either federal or state income tax withholding. That leaves $70.82 to cover the taxes on his tips. Social Security and Medicare tax on his tips totals $42.53. This leaves $28.29 for federal and state income tax withholding. Consulting both the federal and Georgia state withholding tables shows that $29 in federal income tax withholding and $20.50 in state income tax withholding should be collected on the tips. The total tax withholding on Wilbur's wages and tips totals $97.89, which results in a tax withholding deficit of $21.21. Wilbur would receive a $0 paycheck. His federal withholding is 71 cents short, and he ends up with no state withholding at all. Since state income tax withholding on tips comes last, many tipped employees often have annual state income tax withholding that is less than their actual state tax liabilities, resulting in balances due come tax time. This problem only grows as tips grow in relation to wages. In fact, it can grow to the point where there's not even enough wage income to cover the Social Security and Medicare taxes on the tips. When this happens, the Social Security and Medicare taxes that were not collected by the employer have to be paid as additional taxes on the employee's Form 1040. The difference between what the employer collected and what is actually due is shown in Box 12 of Form W-2, coded A for uncollected Social Security tax and B for uncollected Medicare tax. These amounts are added and reported on line 13 of Schedule 2, which transfers to line 23 Form 1040. Employees in this situation also usually have very little federal or state income tax withheld from their tips, and the result can be substantial balances due. So, how can these pitfalls be avoided? First, many establishments allow employees to make up any net pay deficit out of their own funds, or they can carry the deficit forward and apply it toward any positive net pay in the future. Highly tipped employees might also benefit from making quarterly estimated payments to the IRS or state, or if they have other sources of income subject to withholding, increase withholding on those sources. The IRS has publications and forms that give more detail on how tipped employees are taxed, and links to these publications, as well as additional resources and information, are given in the video description. Please like the video if you found it informative, and share it with anyone else who could find it useful. Subscribe to the channel for additional oversimplifications of our overcomplicated tax system. And your questions, comments, and suggestions are always welcome in the comment space below. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon with more of your taxes oversimplified.